for coming to my presentation, which is Virginia as a case study of race and sexuality as factors in the history of book banning. I'm Keith Weimer. I'm the librarian for history and religious studies at the University of Virginia. When I speak of book banning, I'm really speaking of a range of different kinds of book restrictive activities, sort of shorthand for these that can range from requests for sort of notification of materials, and you'll see why this is relevant, notification of sort of sexually explicit course readings, all the way up to outright book bans. And I'm going to especially focus on the invocation of political authority to make these things happen throughout Virginia's history. Okay, already trying to move forward here in my slides. Bear with me for a moment. Goodness. Okay, already we have an issue. Okay, so let me go back to sharing my screen. I apologize for this.
No problem, it happens.
Yeah. Okay, so let me go back to this and hopefully this will move forward a little bit better. So why Virginia? Why talk about Virginia? First of all, Virginia occupies a historic position within the United States. It's the first permanent English colony in what became the United States. Many of our founding fathers of the country came from Virginia, including both George Mason and Thomas Jefferson, who were interested in issues of intellectual freedom, responsible for the Bill of Rights and so on, but also participated in enslavement. And I think that right there tells you a little bit of something about contradictions both within the country and in the state of Virginia. It's also been a crossroads between North and South. It was one of the last states to join the Confederacy. It participated in enslavement and Jim Crow, as well as more progressive currents over the course of its history. And in recent decades, it's drawn attention as a vanguard state, occasionally being a bellwether between conservative and liberal or Republican and Democratic voting trends. This presentation will take the long view. I'll attempt to set the current wave of challenges into a longer historical context. I'll place events in Virginia in the context of national trends, identify arguments that would-be censors have used effectively, talk about examples of how challenges have been addressed and limited. This is not intended to be a comprehensive survey. I'm going to focus on broad historical trends and then on some examples from within the past 50 years where initial challenges to library materials have ended up implicating a broader range of reading material and have affected state or local politics. My methodology is based on a pretty extensive survey of newspaper articles from the state from the past 100 years or so, as well as the available secondary literature that I've been able to find. I do want to stress that this is sort of also the overview and article that I have coming out in the publication Virginia Libraries. It's gone through copy editing, so hopefully it'll be out anytime now. Okay, to talk about long-term trends, one thing I believe is that the current wave of challenges, and I think this has already been amply demonstrated by the legislation and the political involvement, is not some sort of cyclical. I still hear people say this, oh, this is just one of those things. It's happened before, especially maybe in the 1980s. I would agree with the historian Paul Boyer, who in his book Purity in Print has written that each upsurge of repressiveness reflects the political, cultural, and technological realities of those years. That said, race, sex, and religion have been recurring themes in book bans and challenges pretty much from the get-go in this country's history. This will not come as any surprise, I think, to any of you. The first ban on books in Virginia's history that I've been able to identify was passed in March of 1660 by the General Assembly and then Governor Berkeley. It was an outright ban on the publications of the Quakers, a Protestant group you may be familiar with. They've historically tended to be associated with social justice causes. In the 1650s and 60s, they were considerably more radical than they've become. And they kind of bring a number of these themes together. So they were heretical religiously. They did tend to be associated at that time with sexual license, having grown out of the Ranters in some cases, a Protestant sect that emerged in the 1650s, arguing that Christians who are under God's grace need not be bound by the conventions of morality. They were also associated with egalitarianism. They allowed women to preach. There were fears of what would have been called a servile insurrection in Virginia at this time. At this time, enslaved Africans were beginning to outnumber time in the colony's history. Legislation began to be passed in the 1660s and following to try to drive these two groups apart, and to blunt, in general, any of the egalitarian implications of Christian teaching. And you saw this later in the decade in 1667 when a law was passed making it clear that baptism did not free anyone from bondage. So conversions to Christianity on the part of enslaved Africans or enslaved Africans who happened to already be Christian would not automatically be granted their freedom. Planners were very resistant to providing religious instruction to the enslaved during this period. And I would argue that that marks the beginning of what became separate intellectual freedom regimes throughout most of Virginia's history. So for the next 300 years, there were significant differences mandated by various forms of law in white Virginians and Black Virginians' access to information. This would have persisted through the centuries of enslavement, even after religious instruction did become available to the enslaved. For example, in 1831, there was the passage of a law in the wake of Nat Turner's uprising that would have forbade any kind of education for both free and enslaved African Americans, even though some planners continued to provide instruction privately on their estates. Through the century of Jim Crow and segregation that followed the end of the Civil War, there was a system of separate and unequal access to libraries. You see in this slide an example of a photo of a sit-in at McKinney Public Library in Petersburg, Virginia in 1960. Black patrons had exclusive access to the basement level. The card catalog was on the whites only main floor of the library. There were differences in how different parts of the library were upgraded. Essentially, there was a system of Black patrons having to take what they could get. And this was not necessarily atypical of Virginia libraries under segregation. And as we've already kind of heard, I think, in some of the discussion in the previous, in the keynote, and if any of you went to Jim Remus's presentation that preceded this one, a lot of this is reflected in ongoing social justice debates within the library profession. ALA's historic and current role, what to do about things like racist children's literature, whether some notions of intellectual freedom actually harm patrons of color, LGBT patrons and colleagues, and so forth. I do think since the 1960s, we've gotten used to this sense of progress that has recently been powerfully called into question, a notion that there should be increasing freedom of expression, diversity, and attention given to marginalized voices, and a shift from forms of state or national support for censorship to a pattern of localized challenges. And I should mention here the Comstock laws as well, which you may have heard of. These were a series of laws, federal laws, passed beginning in the 1870s that obtained through most of the next century, and some of them are still on the books apparently. These were designed to prevent the spread of obscene material through the mails, and they powerfully shaped library collections under the influence of these laws. They included bans on things like distribution of literature discussing women's sexuality, birth control, and so forth. They were not intended to uphold Jim Crow, but they ran co-eval with Jim Crow, and I would argue that they helped powerfully shape people's expectations of community norms up until about 50 years ago. They also encompassed adults like Jim Crow, and we've begun to see a shift from censorship that included adults to censorship that focused on children. By the late 1950s, the Supreme Court was beginning to look at censorship more in terms of obscenity as something that the work needed to be taken as a whole to appeal to the prurient interest rather than to contain elements that some might judge obscene. And that's still essentially the standard for obscenity today, albeit it is subject to court interpretations and local kinds of understandings of what local community and state law means. Virginia began to dismantle segregation during the 1960s. It also adopted an obscenity law that closely followed the Supreme Court decisions of the late 50s. By the early 70s, Virginia was under a liberal Republican administration. Linwood Holton was governor. And in 1972, the Virginia Department of Education mandated new English textbooks for public schools. There was an avowed intent to instill greater multiculturalism in the curriculum. Many counties adopted the responding series of textbooks that were published by Ginn and Company. This would have been in 1973. There were many textbook controversies throughout the United States in the early 70s, the most spectacular of which would have taken place in Kanawha County, West Virginia in 1974-75. It became very violent. There was a very, very similar controversy that took place in Virginia during the same period. I'm not sure. I still would like to find out if the events in Washington County in the southwestern part of the state had any influence on the Kanawha County protesters. There was no direct contact between the groups that I can tell, but these textbooks were objected to on many grounds. They were objected to on the grounds of foul language. They were objected to on the grounds of being anti-Christian in the content and overall tenor of the stories. The textbooks tended to reflect some of this sort of questioning spirit of the 1960s and early 70s. Race was a subtext more than a direct issue. It was never really couched in racial terms, but the textbooks contained many more Black authors than previous English textbooks. And the perspectives that were offered on sort of the American experience probably did feed into sort of the anti-patriotic objections that some of the protesters made about the books. Over the course of the year between March of 74 and March of 75, the protests spread across Virginia. They were especially strong in the Southwest. The concerned citizens of Washington County, their leaders did try to meet with Republican Governor Mills Godwin and with their state representatives. They only received tepid expressions of sympathy rather than actual support. But in April of 75, the Virginia Board of Education did draw up a new list of textbooks, announced that it expected parents to have the right to review textbooks proposed for their school orally and in writing. I would say that I think these kinds of protests, and probably especially the protest in Kanawha County, West Virginia, publishers took note, and textbooks, I think, moved in a more conservative direction later in the 70s. So the protests had an effect. Because they didn't get beyond this, however, the protesters in Washington County especially moved on to a pattern of local control. They acquired a majority on the County Board of Supervisors and continued to pursue a more conservative agenda through the course of the next several years. By 79 to 80, there was a campaign to teach creationism in the Washington County schools alongside the theory of evolution. This met with partial success. And by the early 80s, the concerned citizens were going after books in the public library, including authors like Sidney Sheldon and Harold Robbins, who published these racy novels with, it was actually sexually explicit content from what I've seen. But then beyond that, to a much wider range of authors who often reflected progressive viewpoints. This had also been true during the responding controversy, where opposition to the textbooks led to opposition and demands to remove library books. The early 80s campaign against the public library drew much more citizen opposition than had happened with the textbooks. The young woman who was the public library director, Kathy Russell, very young woman, who'd been a high school student in the mid-70s during the responding controversy, stood firm for refusing to remove the books, got more support from the public. It did attract a lot of negative media attention, including 60 Minutes. This seemed to be a turning point. One of the leaders of the concerned citizens was then voted off the Board of Supervisors in 1983. One of the pastors who was a leader was apparently told by his congregation, you need to tone it down and focus on us as your congregation rather than this kind of political activity. From what I've heard from people who've gone to school in Washington County who were born around or after the times of these events, this kind of movement, though, had a significant effect on the school district in terms of what was taught, in terms of budget for the schools, and so on. Shifting into some other controversies in the 80s that, again, had broader effects than simply demands for a couple of titles. There was a complaint about a gay newspaper titled Our Own in Virginia Beach in 1980. This complaint and the librarian's refusal to withdraw the paper completely led to a public referendum, quote unquote, on whether the library should carry publications depicting or advocating homosexual acts. This referendum did pass overwhelmingly by a vote of 48,000 to 14,000 votes in November of 1980. It was an advisory referendum, so it did not have the force of law. The pastor who wrote the text of the referendum had been affiliated with Anita Bryant's campaign opposing civil rights for homosexuals in the late 70s. It's not clear whether he intended to go after all literature in the libraries that was gay friendly, or whether he was specifically trying to find a way to get rid of our own. At any rate, the American Civil Liberties Union did file a suit on behalf of the organization that produced the newspaper. The city agreed not to discriminate in early 1981, and the ACLU dropped its suit. In the early 90s, similar complaints about the Blade, another gay newspaper produced in Washington, D.C., in Fairfax County, suburban county in Northern Virginia, led to demands for the inclusion of titles advocating conversion therapy to sort of balance the collection. These were added to the collection. There was a lot of struggle over the library board. There were demands to remove members of the board who had been too stood up for the retention of this newspaper, attempts to vote people off the board. There were demands that went on for the restriction on confidentiality for minors library checkout. A compromise was reached where children up to the age of 12, their parents had the right to review their checkouts. After that, they were confidential. If you see the woman depicted in the image in the patterned blouse, Karen Jo Ganode, she was one of the leaders of this movement, and she went on in the late 90s to found a group called Family Friendly Libraries that acquired a good bit of media attention. Its strategy was also to pursue local politics, getting members on county supervisor boards, library boards, school boards, to try to shape the library in a family-friendly direction, which would be a Christian, conservative, heteronormative direction reflecting Ms. Ganode's own views. There are a lot of similarities in terms of, I think, ideology with Moms for Liberty. However, I have not been able to find links between the two groups. The Fairfax controversy spilled over into a political election where candidates running for statewide legislative office or state legislature in 1995, a woman who was seen as being too close to the protesters did actually lose. That was actually factored in the campaign that led to her losing the election. A statewide solution was developed to objectionable materials came 20 years after this, with the activism of another Fairfax County mom, Laura Murphy, who's depicted here. Ms. Murphy's son was a senior in 2012, taking an advanced placement English class. They were required to read Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. The young man found the violent and sexual content of the novel to be disturbing. Ms. Murphy went to the school board and said, there should be notification for books like there is for movies, so I could request an alternative assignment for my son. The school board rejected her argument, and she worked with political contacts to try and get legislation for the entire state that would reflect this demand. She was successful. In 2016, a bill did pass Virginia's General Assembly with bipartisan support that would have mandated parental notification of any sexually explicit content in school course readings. It was vetoed by Governor McAuliffe, the Democratic governor, the gentleman with the spread hands in the lower image. The Virginia Library Association, with which I was involved at the time, petitioned Governor McAuliffe to veto the bill on the grounds that this particular legislation could have a chilling effect on teachers trying to, introduce maybe more controversial works. It was pointed out that there was a lot of objection to Toni Morrison's novels and other Black authors that were listed. At any rate, 5 years later, this whole issue came back when Governor McAuliffe was running for another term, not a consecutive term, for governor against Glenn Youngkin, the gentleman in the coral tie, the Republican candidate. Terry McAuliffe said in this debate that's depicted here, I don't think parents should be telling teachers what to teach. Youngkin quickly seized on this statement, ran ads featuring Laura Murphy, and called for parental control in education. This tapped into a number of things, including dissatisfaction with the other Democratic governor, Ralph Northam's policies relating to the pandemic, policies of confidentiality for students who identified as transgender, and support for a different approach to teaching about the history of Virginia's racism in Virginia in the public school curriculum. So it drew sort of dissatisfaction over the pandemic, dissatisfaction over sexually explicit content and its supposed influence, and dissatisfaction over critical race theory. In fact, in one of Glenn Youngkin's ads, he had Laura Murphy talk about her experience, albeit not mentioning the novel Beloved by name, but talking about how, Governor McAuliffe pushed parents out and let left-wing bureaucrats in. Now our schools are in chaos, and we quickly switched to an image of Black kids brawling in a cafeteria in, I guess, Chesterfield County. This proved to be a winning issue for Youngkin, or at least he won the election, and it was seized on by the media as a possible bellwether for Republican efforts going forward, since Youngkin had flipped a blue gubernatorial chair. And very quickly after Youngkin was elected, you saw a sort of aggressive wave of calls to remove sexually explicit material, including Beloved, including titles like Genderqueer, in different counties. In Spotsylvania County, one of the county supervisors went so far as to say those books should be burned. And in the winter of 2022, a revived version of Laura Murphy's bill was signed into law by Youngkin, along with legislation prohibiting divisive concepts in public school teaching. This did not allay a movement to continue to restrict library materials. In 2023, additional bills were entered into the General Assembly that would have required school librarians to flag sexually explicit materials so that parents could opt out of allowing their children to check out any of these materials. A bill that would have attempted to redefine obscenity away from the work taken as a whole standard, and a bill that would have prohibited colleges and universities from showing sexually explicit content to minors, which could include college freshmen. I was 17 when I started college myself. All these bills were defeated. They didn't make it out of the committee, and partly because of or largely I think because of Democratic control of the Senate. The book bans have not gone away. I don't think these legislative efforts are going away, so stay tuned. So to wrap it up, I would say that there have always been demands that schools, libraries, education reinforce community norms. There's a perception that restrictions on library materials can help halt or roll back social changes. Some of the things I've seen through this review of Virginia history match some of the research Emily Knox has discovered in her book on 21st century censorship and the attitudes of would-be censors. I would argue that the expectations of community norms have been shaped by a constructed regime of racial and gender norms, sexual norms that were constructed over a long period of time. These arguments have been effective. The widest support for censorship tends to surround school texts and children's literature, especially where people can point to foul language or sexual scenes. The would-be censors do have a tendency to read texts literally. They tend to see reading as a very powerful experience, and there seems to be an impression that if kids read about gay kids, or if kids read about kids doing drugs or whatever it is, they'll want to go out and do it. I do believe the current level of political support for censorship marks a new development, at least since the 1960s. It's been compounded by social media and this sort of ability to share successful tactics, to share objectionable content very quickly, to spread kind of horror stories. I also believe that the demands of censors tend to grow over time. They're not necessarily mollified by the removal of one or two titles or the meeting of whatever initial demands are presented. I also believe the demands of censors tend to be connected to other issues, like in Washington County, dissatisfaction with the school system, school consolidation, the school budget. And I think this is probably also true for opposition. Again, to use the Washington County example where, especially when the concerned citizens went after adult literature, and once they were no longer an insurgency, but had become the establishment, opposition tended to grow. And it seems to me that opposition to censorship is a combination of firm stances by individuals like Kathy Russell, and support within the community can shift, as well as the appearance of outside media attention and state or national organizations' activism, like the Virginia Library Association, American Library Association, or American Civil Liberties Union. With that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. You do have my email here. There's a bibliography attached to this slide. I'm happy to share it, and I'll take any questions you may have. Thank you. Let me take a look at the chat. Does anybody have any questions that haven't been represented in the chat for me? Well, if not, I'll give you guys 5 minutes back. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me. And I do thank you all for your attendance and for the positive remarks.
Thank you, Keith. Great presentation.
Thank you very much.
I'll go ahead
All
and
right.
stop the recording.
Okay. All right. Take care, everybody.